Good morning, everyone. We're getting some more people on the call. We'll get started in a few minutes. So just want to make sure you are all able to see the media landscape slide. Okay, fantastic. Okay, I've got 11 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to just kind of do a little introduction here. My name's Beth Statz. I am with Minitex and super excited to be heading up another Media Landscapes event. And some of you may have attended some of the Media Landscapes events in the past. If not, we are really happy that they are funded by Minitex, PALS, the Minnesota Multi-Type Library Systems, and CRIPSLA. So we want to send a thank you out to those folks for helping us get this campaign off the ground and running. Just to reiterate some of the campaign goals, basically, this campaign is used to help librarians and library staff in the state as well as outside of Minnesota get a better sense of how to navigate the media information landscape, considering this sort of online world that we're in, and to help us to build some reflection and intentionality into our information consumption, as well as get some strategies to help us work with our patrons and our communities, so we can perhaps gain some more intentional approaches to dealing with the media and information landscape. So we have now quite a few past media landscape events. You can see we started off with Renee Hobbs, Navigating a World Full of Propaganda, moved on to Deep Fakes with John Mack Freeman, a little bit of critical thinking and information evaluation with Lisa Hines, using news literacy to make sense of the current media landscape presented by Michael Spikes. Some information on journalism ethics and standards by Dave Hagee and Kelly Smith of the Star Tribune. Civically Engaging Young Adults Through Media Literacy Education, presented by Jamaica Anderson. And then most recently was What's New in Digital Citizenship by our own Mary Messicomer. So all of these recordings can be accessed at the web address on this slide. You can access the recordings, presentation slides, there are discussion questions. And then we also have something called 23 Things. And these 23 things are available at levelupmn.org. And these, it's a self-paced online learning program to help you and your library staff engage with these issues on a more personal level. And it covers, so far, I think they're at 10 of the 23 things. And some of these include deep fakes, propaganda, critical thinking, and more. So be sure, if you haven't signed up for that, to check those out. We do have some upcoming Media Landscapes events. Next up in November is Penny Abernathy, who will be presenting Uncovering the Truth in News Deserts. And the registration is open for this one. However, for the following two, the Combating Media Nihilism with Intergenerational Discussion and the For Against Neutral Assignment, we don't have the registration up for those events yet. We will probably within the next week or so, and those events are scheduled for 2022. And with that, I am really happy to introduce Rachel Whiteman. She's Associate Director for Instruction and Outreach at Concordia University. She's worked in academic libraries in the US and abroad. She's always been drawn to teaching the most practical of information literacy skills. Whether she's in a college classroom or working with church congregations, she loves teaching people how to consume information wisely and engage mindfully in online spaces. So with that, I am going to stop sharing and pass this over to Rachel.
Great, thanks, Beth. I'm going to pull up my slides and then I'll get started. Thank you all for being here today. And thank you to everyone at the Media Landscapes campaign for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here today. My goal really is to just provide a space to share a little bit about the work I've been doing kind of outside of my full-time job, and maybe just share some things that I've been learning and hopefully some tools that might be helpful in terms of helping us all think about other spaces we can bring some of our skills as librarians and information professionals. So I'll go ahead and Beth already sort of introduced me, but just a little bit more about myself. I've been an academic librarian for over 10 years, and I have my MLIS from the University of Illinois. And as Beth said, I'm currently the Associate Director for Instruction and Outreach at Concordia University in St. Paul. And a fun fact about me, which was alluded to, is that I lived in Uganda for 2 years and worked as a librarian there as well. So I've worked in a really wide variety of academic settings. And then in 2020, I started teaching workshops and classes for church congregations and have been working with churches around the country to provide news literacy, information literacy skills to those churches. So I really plan to use today as sort of a case study about some of the work I've been doing. And then, like I said, just share maybe some things that will help us think about other spaces we can bring these skills to. Because obviously we know that misinformation, disinformation is everywhere. And I don't think there's just one approach in terms of how we address that. So I will definitely leave time at the end for questions as well. So just know that there'll be time at the end. Feel free to use the chat as well. So my agenda for today is really to just start by giving you a little bit of the background of how I started offering these faith and fake news classes, a little bit of the logistics of how I partner with churches and church congregations, a little bit about some of the content that I cover, and then just some questions for us to reflect on, some application again on kind of translating our profession into other areas of our lives, other spaces. And again, I think that this is what we're seeing with this campaign, right? There have been so many interesting webinars on so many topics, and there's so many ways to approach this, and this is just one of them. I don't pretend to think that this is the cure-all, but I do hope that it is a way to provide this kind of content in a new space. So I thought I would start by just saying a little bit about churches and misinformation. A lot of times when I talk to people and mention that I am offering these workshops and classes to churches, and I'll say like, oh, I'm teaching some classes for some churches on misinformation and disinformation. The immediate reaction is like, you're doing what? And that tends to be sort of this kind of puzzled reaction, like, what? Like there's a little bit of a disconnect. Like, why would I be doing this? And I really feel like, as we know, misinformation and disinformation are everywhere. We're seeing that in our social media feeds. We're seeing that in our personal lives, in the information that we consume. And so to me, which I will get into, is sort of how this started. It wasn't a big step to also know that churches are experiencing division. This is not new for churches to experience division. I mean, we have all these different congregations, all these different denominations of churches. And so I felt like there was a space to bring information literacy training into a new space. And I'm using the term information literacy because that is what I use in my academic setting. But really what I'm doing in these classes is much broader than just what we consider information literacy in the academic libraries, but really looking at news literacy, media literacy, just looking really broadly at information as a whole, not necessarily the research skills that I teach in my full-time job at Concordia. But this is what we do as librarians, right? We see a need, we want to fill it, and we see the spaces in which information can fill that need. And so churches were just another space that I noticed that there was potentially room for this kind of instruction, this kind of content, and it was a way to meet people where they already are. The other thing that I feel like I've kind of learned through all of this, that I'm sure I'll continue to come back to throughout this presentation, is the other reason that I think churches have been a really great venue for connecting media literacy, news literacy, all the literacies, is that it helps by working with a church congregation. I'm able to have people reflect on their deeper values and motivations. Obviously, for this group of people that I'm working with, this population, their faith is really important to them. And, you know, giving them space to connect things like, how do you do a fact check, to something a little bit deeper has been really rewarding, because I think it allows them to really take that on in a new way. It's not just like, here's some skills, here's some things you should do. But for them personally, it's a way to connect it to their faith. Obviously, other populations and groups of people have different motivations or values, and that's fine. It's just that with this population, I found that it's a way to connect to those deeper motivations. And I think that that's something that as librarians and library staff, we don't always do. We teach these skills, but sometimes we forget that bigger context. And we don't always help people connect that to why they might want to use these skills. And so working with churches has been a way to do that. And so that's sort of a little bit about why I chose to start this process. And again, I am often met with a lot of confusion. And so I think the more that I can share why this came about, hopefully the more helpful that is. And I'm a context person, so I want to give you a little bit of the history of sort of how this even got started, besides just the need that I saw, but like some very specific events that led to this turning into from an idea to an actual implementation and multiple churches that I've worked with. So this actually goes all the way back to 2019. So if you can put yourself back in 2019, before a pandemic started, which feels like a lifetime ago. I attend a church in Northeast Minneapolis called Mill City Church. And I had a series of conversations that fall, personal conversations, and then some more formal things that happened that really prompted me to start thinking about this idea. So if you can think back to 2019, we were pre-pandemic, we had a different president in this country. Things looked a little bit different than what they do now. And even then, so even in 2019, I was having conversations with friends around misinformation, and they didn't use that term. But I was having these personal conversations where people were talking about how, they were seeing this division in social media. They were struggling with how to talk to their parents about politics. We were looking ahead to 2020 as an election year. And so I was just noticing these conversations I was kind of having over and over again with friends around, again, they weren't using the term misinformation, but it was definitely a theme of how do I talk to people who might believe things that are different than me, and particularly believe things that aren't true. How do I engage with them? How do I have productive conversations? How do I care about these people well? And so I had those personal conversations throughout the fall, and I just kind of noticed, like, okay, people are struggling with this. And then during that time, I also took a class through my church on intercultural competence. And Mill City Church offers regular classes. They call them equipping classes, as a space for people to take their faith into other areas of their lives. And so a lot of them are really practical classes. They've offered classes on financial literacy and how to create a budget, and how does your faith inform the way you spend your money. Obviously, some of those classes are more focused on, Christianity and the Bible. They've also offered classes on things like how to be emotionally healthy. But in fall of 2019, I took a class on intercultural competence. And these classes are always taught by experts that are either part of the church or they're brought in to teach these classes. And this particular class on intercultural competence was literally about how to be more competent with people from other cultures and backgrounds than our own, which is obviously a really important topic. And it's something that I think people of faith are hopefully starting to engage in more. And is obviously really important. And I remember during this class, they talked, of course, about implicit and explicit bias. And I kept thinking while they were sharing about those things that what about the information we consume, and how does that impact maybe those areas in terms of our biases? If I read news source X and you read news source Y, but we're never looking at each other's news sources, how is that impacting our biases? And I had a conversation with one of the facilitators of that class, and he's really great. And this is what he does for a living, is intercultural competence training. And he and I had a really good conversation around information and news and kind of how that impacts our world. And so I had started to crystallize these things slowly, like, oh, here's a need, here's another conversation. And then finally, in the fall of 2019, our church did a sermon series on systemic racism and talking about how to address that. And one of our pastors said this statement that has stuck with me. And he said, it's really important for us as people of faith, or just people in general, maybe, to check our inputs, meaning it's really important for us to get information from multiple sources and different perspectives in order to use that as a tool to address larger issues in our culture. In that case, he was talking about racism. And in that moment is kind of when it all crystallized for me, was that people were clearly struggling with how to engage with information. We're talking a lot about bias and racism in our culture, and they need better information. And I thought in that moment, people don't just stumble into good information. We need to give them tools to do that well. Thinking about things like filter bubbles, I knew that it could be hard for people to find different inputs because they may not see them depending on their social media feeds or their Google search results or whatever. And so it was sort of a whole bunch of things in fall of 2019 where I thought, there's a need here for people to engage with better information, and maybe not better information, but different kinds of information. And so I approached my pastor and I asked her, could I offer an equipping class on sort of this intersection of information and fake news and evaluating information and faith. And it was kind of a murky idea at that point, but because we were looking at 2020 as potentially a really divisive year in our politics, she was like, yes, I think we need that. We definitely need to start talking about that. So in the beginning of 2020, I offered this class for the first time at Mill City Church. It was a 6-week class for an hour every Sunday. And it started in January, and our last session was the week before the pandemic was declared. So I felt like COVID was in the air by the time we finished. It might not have physically been in the room, but certainly talk about it. And that was the only in-person time I've ever offered this class, because literally a week after I finished, COVID was a thing. We all went home. As you know, 2020 was not just an election year. And so it was something I thought of a lot throughout the summer as well of 2020, as I saw what happened to George Floyd. I saw what was happening in the news. We were still looking ahead to an election. There was a pandemic going on. And as a librarian, I think that's something we see that other people may not. And for some of us, it has become sort of second hat. We notice information, we notice news, we're paying more attention to information than other people are. And so all throughout 2020, I kept thinking about this concept. And so I ended up connecting with my pastor again and said, I think we might need to do this class again. And she agreed with me. And so with everything happening with COVID, we offered the class again at Mill City Church in the fall of 2020, so about a year ago. That time was on Zoom, and I did make some tweaks to sort of some of the things that we covered based on the fact that we were all dealing with COVID in our world and all the information around it, right? Like, people are struggling to find good information on the pandemic, on world events. We were right before an election, so we talked a lot in that class around finding political information, reading different news sources, and NPR ended up visiting one of my sessions. One of the members of my church works for NPR. She's a reporter, and she connected me with Catherine Richert, whom, if any of you listen to NPR, may have heard her. But she was really interested in this idea that a church would offer training on how to be a wise consumer of information. And so she visited one of the sessions. Some of you may have heard that story last fall. And I feel like that was a really exciting time, because I think people were starting to recognize, like, there are other spaces that people can talk about these things. I think in the library world, we can tend to think like it happens in academic libraries, public libraries. All the libraries are doing this work, but it was a really interesting and fun time to start talking about it in a different space. And then once that article came out, I was able to connect with a number of other churches. So throughout this past year, I've worked with at least 6 churches. I was trying to remember last night how many it's been, but it's been about at least 6 churches around the country. I have only really ever worked with one at a time, just because of the time commitment, and I do have a full-time job. But it's been a really exciting thing this past year to work with different churches. They have all been from different denominations. So if you're familiar with with Christianity, there are different denominations like Baptists and Lutherans and Presbyterians. And so far, every single church has been from a different denomination, which tells me that it's not siloed into a particular brand of Christianity, but that it's very across many different groups of people that are saying, hey, this is something we're seeing in our congregation. This is something we're seeing in our church, that people need to talk about these things. And so that's just kind of the history. This is how we ended up where we are today. I have plans to work with another church this fall. Not surprisingly, things kind of lightened up a little bit over the summer. That doesn't surprise me, because it was summer and we all were getting vaccines and things felt like they were opening up, for at least for a little while. And so, that's just how it is. It's one of those things that ebbs and flows. But that's literally a timeline of how we ended up with this confusing thing for a lot of people when I say, again, churches and misinformation. A little bit about the logistics, because I think this is also helpful as librarians for us to think about. I use existing church structures. So when I work with a church, I don't just come in and say, okay, well, I'll come on Tuesday evenings at 6 p.m. It's literally asking a congregation what structures do you already have in place? And I think that's also a very librarian thing to do, is to look again for what is already there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. I don't need to just come in with my own schedule. I started this with a structure that was already in place at the church I attend. And that's what I've continued to do. So if a church tells me, hey, we have Wednesday nights is when we offer our classes, then that's when I've done the classes. And I know that's could be tricky because of my own personal schedule, but I've tried really hard to stick within the structure that they use and would prefer. Because if they already have a structure in place, that's the time people are already looking for the content, or for content in general. If I come in with I only do Monday nights, then potentially that's not a time people are free. But I know that many churches already have a structure. And so that's what I use. And I always meet with church leadership before I offer classes. So again, this is kind of a librarian thing to do. I think these are the things that we're really good at as information professionals. We see needs, we're able to address them. And I think that is a gift that we have in terms of this work around media literacy, is that we have things that we do naturally as part of our profession. And those are the things that we can bring into other spaces. And again, this is just one avenue. You may have other structures in your life, in your communities, where this could be, where you could have conversations. But I always meet with the church leadership prior to starting any classes with them, because I want to understand what the need is. And I usually ask questions around, conversations they've noticed in their congregation. What are some of the divisions that they're seeing? Not surprisingly, most of it this past year has been around COVID. But other things sometimes come up, and then I'm able to use the language that they use when I'm talking about this, so that I'm really contextualizing these skills into the spaces that these churches are offering. At this point, each church, there's been a variety of the number of sessions that they've asked for. Generally, I've been doing about 4 sessions per church. So I've developed a pretty structured curriculum, but I can tweak it for each church. So I have sort of a set series of topics that I go through in order to make sure that we're talking about the things that I feel are important. I have like a master spreadsheet with resources and, a whole folder structure so I can keep track of my PowerPoints. But I do tend to offer kind of the same thing for each church with, again, that contextualization. So kind of making sure that it fits within kind of the things that they're seeing. Obviously, there have been maybe one or two churches that only wanted one session. I advise them against that, just because I don't think we can really talk about as much. But I'm willing to work with them, and then hopefully at least I've started a conversation for them. And so the number of sessions really does vary. Some of the things that I cover in these sessions, again, depends on the number of sessions, but in general, these are some of the main things that I talk about. I am an instruction librarian by profession, so this really shows up in what I do, because I think a lot about how to plan a lesson and how to pause for discussion. I actually do include quite a bit of time for discussion. I'm very upfront with everyone that we are not discussing current events in the sense that we're not debating them. I try to be really upfront that I want this to be a safe place for discussion, that we're going to be respectful in how we talk, because obviously where people get information from, and again, I'm using the word information very broadly. So this means social media, it means news, it means using Twitter, it means all of the things. But I try to be really clear that we all get our information from different places and we have different opinions, but we can still discuss things respectfully. I always, no matter how many sessions I cover, I always start by talking about the information landscape and the media landscape. I think this is one area where librarians know maybe we're not computer scientists, but we know more than a lot of people about this. And this is something I think most people do not understand or think about very much. And that could be just the populations I've been working with, but helping people think about that the filter bubbles that they are in, the echo chambers that they are in, based on where they're getting their news, their social media, feels really important to me, especially with this particular population. I spend a lot of time talking about why it matters, thinking about that thing that my pastor said, right? Checking our inputs and checking where we're getting our information from. And we talk about how do we get out of that and why. I think the other piece that comes into every single session that I do is giving people space to reflect on how their faith shows up in their online spaces or not. And this is one area where I think people in these classes have been able to really think about, oh, what does it say about me if I'm in a filter bubble and I'm always just getting my news from the same place over and over again? And allowing them to think like, is that the kind of faith that I want to have? And so I always spend quite a bit of time on that. And I have had some really great conversations with people. I remember one class, a woman was like, but I really like my personalized Target coupons, because we talked about how algorithms predict behavior. And so we wrestle with that in these sessions. I try to help people think through, like, yeah, there are some really big advantages. You get personalized coupons. Amazon suggests that you should reorder something. Those are not bad things. But at what point are we putting ourselves too far into a bubble that we're not able to see other perspectives or engage with people who might be different than us? And what does that mean? And so this is where I probably spend the most amount of my time, and just helping people think through that. We also spend some time going over fact-checking tips like reverse image searching or lateral reading. Those are just examples. This really depends on the amount of time that I have. Sometimes I'll have them watch a video, or I'll have them bring examples of something they saw in the news, and we'll like literally fact check it. We talk about, fact checking websites. My goal is never to teach anyone to like do all the things, because no one's ever going to do all the things all the time. But to just give them some tools to say, hey, you saw an image on Twitter, like, let's talk about how you can kind of do a little research around that. How do you know if it's true? You saw this crazy headline when you were scrolling through social media. Let's do a quick check. How can you look at that differently? Because I think, as we all know, social media and our online spaces are designed to keep us engaged and not always to give us the best information. And so just giving people some really practical tools that are not complicated. And it doesn't mean that they need to become a librarian, but they can learn a few things. That evaluating information piece is also really important. And then again, just lots of time for discussion, lots of time to reflect on their faith. A lot of churches use a phrase called loving their neighbor. And so we talk about, what does that look like to do in an online space? Probably doesn't mean to leave mean comments on people's pictures, things like that. But it also means not spreading misinformation. And so helping people think about, how do I make sure I'm not part of spreading misinformation is part of the conversation as well. I like to use the term being a wise consumer of information, being mindful. Those are some phrases that I use with people a lot, and we talk through kind of what that looks like. I saw that there was a question, which I'm going to come back to. The other thing, this is a slide I share with the classes that I visit. what the class is and what it is not. So I don't believe, and probably most of you would agree, as librarians, I'm not trying to give rules like you should only get your news from this place and never from that place. It's more about giving people tools to evaluate what they're seeing online and what they're finding, and not about like, only look here, never look there, because I also don't think that's really realistic. And what I've also found is that when people are willing to look at a different news source than maybe what they're used to, sometimes it gives them empathy for the people in their lives that they know are reading that other news source. I also try to make clear that the class is not someplace where I'm going to change anyone's mind on a social event or social issue or problem. We're not going to, I'm not here to say vote this way, vote that way. We're not debating those topics. We might use a current event as an example of how to evaluate the news, but we are not debating those topics. Instead, the classes are really spaces to help people evaluate what they're seeing, discussing the information landscapes, how that intersects with their faith, reflection questions, thinking about how to be mindful, giving them lots of resources for finding different viewpoints on different topics. So I'll mention it again later, but I often show them allsides.com just as a space to say, hey, here's a tool that you can use. And I suppose that's a very librarian thing to do, right? Is to connect people to tools and resources. So I always show this slide in the classes because I want people to understand that we're not debating topics. We're not doing, like, that's not the point. The point is to really help people reflect on themselves and where they are and what they're doing when it comes to information. I often use this sort of framework to help guide the classes that I offer. So I always start with, first, we're going to understand the information landscape. That's that algorithms piece, the filter bubbles, the echo chambers, social media. How do we understand that big picture of the information landscape? Then how do we have tools? That's the evaluation piece, the tools, the fact-checking tools to help people figure out, is this true? And then giving people space to then choose and discern how they want to engage with that information. What does it look like to love your neighbor in an online space? How do you address misinformation when you see it? And it's been a really cool opportunity to hear people in these classes talk to each other. I don't necessarily know these people. I'm a guest and they know each other. They go to the same church. And so it's been a really cool opportunity, especially around this last point of how they engage with information and how they address misinformation. A lot of times people have shared tools with each other, like, oh, I had to have this conversation with so-and-so because they thought whatever about COVID, and here's how I handled that. And I think that that's been really encouraging for me to see people helping each other and figuring out, hey, this is a conversation I had, here's how it went, here's what I said. Or other people who say, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to talk to my parent about this. I don't know how to talk to my friend because we disagree and they're getting their news from this other place. And so I think that last point, number 3, has been where I've been able to see some really encouraging conversations as people have done that. And then throughout all of it, I ask people to reflect on how their faith is impacting those activities. And I think, again, that's where some really encouraging conversations have come out because they have been able to think through. I'll often ask them, like, what are the values that you have in your faith? And then how does that play out and in these different areas? And that's been a really encouraging thing to hear people say, like, oh, I really want to love people better, or I want to have better conversations. I want to be more productive. And so I think that that's been a really cool way to just hear what people are thinking and give them space to think about that. So I'm just going to show a few things that I show these classes just to give you a sense. If you have never looked at this graphic from Project Information Literacy, this came out in the beginning of 2020. And I have found it, I'm not going to read it. I know it's very tiny. You can look it up. You're all librarians. But it's a fabulous graphic about how algorithms work and how data is collected about what we do and then can result in some of the divisions that we see through social media. And I have found this to be I'm so grateful that they created this. The Project Information Literacy Study was about college students, which is a great study, but I actually just love this graphic. And I'd encourage you to look it up. It's a really helpful tool to share with people, to help us all think about how do we get from data and information to some of the things we see in our world, which I think we can all agree are really hard and frustrating to be around, that division that we see. And this is something I have shared, I think, with every class, and almost always has sparked a really good conversation, because people are like, oh, I never thought about how we get from information to that sort of division in our politics and in our world. And that this has been really helpful. So I'd encourage you to look up this graphic when you get a chance. It's under a Creative Commons license. And it's just fabulous in terms of helping people understand. So if you're looking for something to share in some other space, this has been instrumental in a lot of ways, because I think we know these things as librarians and library staff and information professionals, but I don't think a lot of people think about these things. And so even just saying, hey, I saw this graphic, isn't this crazy? I think is a way to just open the door to a conversation that many people haven't even thought of. And then this is a quote from an article by Cal Newport that I often share as well, because I think this is another area that people may not be thinking about. And it's just about social media. And it says, and I'll go ahead and read it because I do think it's really helpful. Early social media focused on the behaviors that make people feel better. You would post things about yourself, check in, interact with your friends. Modern social media, which largely displaced the individual feed model with algorithmically generated timeline, instead emphasizes passive content consumption, as the amount of times you can check on your friends in a given week is relatively small, while the time you can dedicate to content consumption is boundless. And I think this is another area where I'm trying to create conversations for people in these churches to think about how and if they're just passively consuming information, or if they're being intentional about, well, why did you go to that site? Where did you go? And we talk a little bit about how those websites, they want to keep you on the page because you click on it and then they get more money. And so helping people just start to think about those things. I always try to say, like, I'm not trying to scare anyone away. Like, I'm not going to say never use the internet again or social media or whatever, but we need to think about these things. And I think for people of faith, helping them think through that in a faith-based way that helps them say, okay, as a person of faith, as someone who wants to be intentional in my community, with my family, with whatever those values are, I hope that this creates that space for them to think through that. Again, I talk a little bit about fact-checking skills. There are tons of really great videos. I like this MediaWise for Seniors list of videos. I know it says seniors, and I always tell everyone in the class, like, don't get caught up in the seniors, because not everyone, that is a question I get a lot. Not everyone that takes these classes is older. Sometimes people think like, oh, it's for older people, but it's not. I've had a huge range of ages. And then a lot of times, again, going back to this idea of connecting these ideas to people's values. Sometimes I'll pose the question, why do you even want to learn these skills? Why do you care? Why do you want to be better at fact checking? Why do you want to learn how to, do lateral reading? Why does it matter to you? And I can tell you, again, it's not a ton of churches, but it's quite a few people at this point. It's probably at least 100 people I've worked with. They want to do it because they care about the people in their lives. And I know that churches often get a bad rap for being to whatever way you want to go with it. But what I have found that in general, these are very kind, loving people who want to do better. And they want these skills because they want to make sure that they're not spreading misinformation. They want to make sure that they aren't sharing the wrong thing. And I have found that most people, if they may want to talk to someone in their life about it as well and say, hey, I don't know if that's actually true, but they want these kinds of resources so that they can use them with the people in their lives as well. I've had a lot of people say like, oh, I'm so glad you shared this video with us because I can share it with someone in my life. And I think it's been really encouraging just to see that kind of response to just these kinds of videos. You can kind of see on the playlist there on the right-hand side, none of these videos, they're like 2 minutes or less. So they're not very long and they get straight to the point. And there's tons of resources out there like this that can just make a small difference. The last thing I wanted to mention that, because I know we're going to run out of time soon, I want to leave time for questions, is this being kind in online spaces. This is also a huge part. I would say the fact checking skills has become actually a smaller piece of what I do, and sort of that algorithmic and then this being kind space. These are the two things that I feel like people are really hungry to talk about. This is a graphic from the News Literacy Project, which is awesome, about how to speak up without starting a showdown. And I've really liked this graphic as a way to help people think about how do you talk to people in your life. And we all know that not everyone in our lives wants to have these kinds of conversations. So we talk a lot as a group in these classes around how do you open the door? And maybe there's some people you can't open the door with, and that's okay. And so we talk a lot about that. Sometimes people will say, I've tried with so-and-so and it's really hard and it's not working. And the other people in the group will come around them and say, yeah, I know what you mean. And helping people to give them permission to say, like, you know what, maybe I need to take a break from trying with this person. And what's really interesting about this graphic that some of the classes have noticed is that some of these principles, even on this graphic, are very similar to some Christian principles about how to have kind conversations. And so it's been really cool for me as a facilitator to say, hey, here's something from another organization that's really helpful. And then have someone say, hey, this is similar to a Christian principle that we practice in my life, which is finding common ground. And then people will talk about that. And so this is just another space where I'm trying to open up conversation, let people think about this, talk to each other, get ideas, and really think about what does it look like to be kind? And what does it look like to love neighbors? What does it look like in online spaces to do those things? And I also encourage people to practice humility for themselves. Sometimes when we engage with new perspectives, we might change our mind on something, and giving people permission to change their mind and practice humility. And that's also resulted in some really great conversations as well. Some other resources that I've used, kind of, like I said, allsites.com, the News Literacy Project. There's a really great series of videos on YouTube, Control F, which is also with Mike Caulfield, who's done a lot of work in this area. Tons of TED Talks on these topics. So these are things that I've found helpful in the classes. Sometimes they're helpful for me to just share one-on-one with someone I know in my life. Like, hey, I saw this cool TED Talk. Do you want to watch it? And again, opening that door to maybe addressing some misinformation. So all of these things put together have allowed me to take these professional skills that I use all the time, right? How do you evaluate information? How do you be mindful? How do you be wise in your online spaces? And just to take this into a new conversation, a new space. So I guess just some questions for you to reflect on. I think one of the biggest things we have to offer the media literacy world and addressing misinformation is our ability to see the bigger picture of the information landscape. I think that that's something that a lot of people don't understand, and that's something we do, and that's something we can bring into our conversations, into other spaces. Are there people that you can help connect those dots? What structures already exist in your life? I'm not advocating that everyone work with a church because that's not for everyone. I totally understand that. But I think there are new spaces that we as librarians, library staff, information professionals can probably bring some of this content and these things that we know that may not be in our traditional library spaces. Where are people already going, and how can we provide that? I think the advantage for me of working with churches, again, is that it's going to a space people are already going. And in my case, they're already a pretty reflective bunch of people. Obviously they are, because they're seeking this out. These are churches that contacted me and said, hey, I heard you do this thing. We need this. Obviously not every church is like that. Not every group is like that. But there are certainly spaces where people are already going, they're already looking for reflection, they want to pay attention. And so these are just things I thought we could all think about in terms of where are these spaces. They may be structured spaces, they may not be official spaces, but there may be places that we can take our skills. The last thing I thought I would just go over is these are some of the things I've learned working with churches. It's a really interesting mix of two worlds. But doing this work, being mindful in an online space and being willing to address misinformation and confront it is very hard work. Not everyone will want to do it, but a lot of people do. And I think that's okay. I like to tell them, the people in these classes, that I don't expect everyone to slow down and fact check every little thing they ever read. I don't even do that. But if somebody slows down one time a day or once a week, that's still more times than they were slowing down before. And to me, that is one step closer to addressing this issue that we have of misinformation in our world, disinformation. If people slow down and are willing to practice mindfulness and kindness, and for Christians to say, I want to love my neighbor better, I don't want to spread misinformation, that's huge. And again, if they only do it sometimes, that's still more than they were doing before. And I've had people contact me later and say, I don't do every single thing you've told me, but I always pause now before I share something or whatever. I'm like, that's huge. That's my goal. My goal isn't to make someone fact check everything. I also believe it's really important to connect these skills and ideas to people's deeper values, and allow people to think about how their values intersect with some of these ideas, because that's what's going to result in change. I think that, especially as an academic librarian, I work with students all the time, and it can be easy to feel like all we do is say, hey, use the library database, don't use Google. But I'm learning that it's really important to help people think about why they're doing these things so that it's a lasting change. And then the last thing is, I'm also learning over and over again, I don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of great resources out there. We see they're posted on listservs. This Media Landscapes campaign is obviously a great example of those 23 things. There's so many great resources that we can use. And it doesn't have to be a structured whole workshop. It can just be sharing those in small spaces, one-on-one with the people in our lives. And what I have found overall, which I guess I forgot to put on this slide, is that the people I'm working with in these contexts are generally really great people who really want to do better. And I think that's really encouraging. I think for those of us in these spheres where we're like, does anyone care? There really are people out there that want to say, hey, my faith is important to me, and that is going to impact how I see the world and what I do and why I want to do this well. So be encouraged, at least, that there are people out there that want to do that. I want to leave time for questions. This is my contact information. Feel free to contact me. I have a website, and then I've also in the past year started an Instagram account where I share tips and tricks with people in terms of helping create content that's just very quick and to the point. Sometimes it's reflection questions, sometimes it's a step-by-step. I think last week I posted like, how do you fact check a meme? And so it's a place where I provide some of that content for people to just take a look at. So with that, I guess I'll stop sharing my screen and I can see what some of these questions are. Hold on.
Thanks, Rachel. Yep, it looks like there's a question that came in through the Q&A.
Okay. Yeah, there's a question here from Leslie that says, when I've interacted with church members from my congregation about fact checking, individuals ask, how do you have time? And of course you do this because of your job. How do you counteract these responses? Yeah, 100%. Those are certainly things people have brought up to me as well. I think I try to really emphasize that not everything needs to be fact checked every single time, which I kind of alluded to. Giving people tools and talking about fact checking websites. A lot of people will say, oh, but I've heard that Snopes is really liberal, or I heard that such and such is really conservative. And trying to say like, yeah, everything has some bias, but sometimes those websites have already fact checked it, so you might as well just take a look at it. So just trying to create conversation around that. And then, yeah, this idea of because it's our job. Again, I've really tried to emphasize with people that it doesn't have to be a huge thing. It can just sometimes be, hey, one small thing. And yes, it's my job, but part of my job is to find the resources to share with you so that you don't have to do as much as I'm doing, if that makes sense. So, but yeah, that can be really challenging. But yeah, having those smaller pieces like, hey, here's a video or whatever. You don't need a library degree. And I go with the thing that's like, hey, if you fact checked one thing this week, you're still doing more than you were doing before. Maybe that's too simplistic. I don't know if there's.
It looks like there's another question here in the chat. Do you see that, or I can read it to you?
I'm just trying to pop it out a little bit so I can see better. Fact checking for sermon preparation. Oh, interesting. I don't know of any off the top of my head that would be like particular for sermons. Things like Snopes and factcheck.org are often more about current events. I don't know if I know of anything off the top of my head that's sermon preparation, but feel free to send me an email with maybe a little more information about what you're looking for, and I'm happy to kind of brainstorm with you what might be helpful. And then I saw that somebody was interested as a non-librarian. Again, please send me an email, and I'm happy to talk with you further about some specific things about how to connect you with that. Are there any other questions? Again, I hope this is just helpful to give people space to think about the spaces in which we are talking with people about these things, and maybe the places that we could talk to people about addressing this information and addressing and giving them tools to become more news and information literate. Like I said, I think it's going to be a multi-pronged approach to address the things that we're seeing in our world. And so this is one avenue, but I know there's a lot more that I'm sure I have not thought of. So are there any other questions or comments?
Any other final questions? All right, well, Rachel, I want to thank you so much. And we will have a link to the recording up on the website, the Level Up website, within the next few days.
Great, and I shared my contact information, so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. Thanks,
everyone. Have a great day.